The recent European Council summit in Bratislava featured a logo showing a fortress with a lot of national flags. This is not an uncontroversial presentation of the EU, of course. Rather, one would have expected a European house with European colors, or not having a house at all. In any case, the Fortress Europe notion, seen as autonomous from the rest of the world, could, of course, afford a one-way communication. But this is far away from the EU vision of an integrated EU with the world, both open and secure. So, from this perspective, we will now discuss the issue of communication. When you discuss accession or enlargement, you sometimes get the feeling that what is needed is a policy of clear conditionality, just telling those who want to get into the EU what they need to do. But of course, EU external action again has moved beyond these simplistic notions of one-way communication. There is increased conviction that the EU needs to be interactive and responsive to develop security and cooperation and together. And there is, of course, a need to see this as a problem, in particular after the financial crisis, the irregular migration and so on, which has made the domestic political situation both inside and outside the EU less favorable to an EU role. So, all of this will require a lot of skill in the current situation, as illustrated not only in the EU context, but in many other countries and regions of the world. Look at the way the Russian people is disengaging in politics, as illustrated by the recent elections. Look at the way the electorate in the United States is polarized during the electoral campaign. And look at Brexit and the domestic political situation in a number of European countries. So here comes a big problem. The EU is not good at two-way communication. It has a big problem in terms of multitasking to start with. The notion has been for many years that it is a high representative and almost only the high representative is supposed to be visible in the media. She has said herself that this has to change. The EU needs to be an orchestra with many actors, although as far as possible playing from the same score. And then there is a problem of developing this score in a sufficiently flexible way to allow for interaction and dialogue. In formal settings such as in international organizations, this has proven to be almost impossible to do in an effective way, at least on the formal level. How can the EU have a flexible debate with Russia, for instance, in the Permanent Council in the OSCE, which is based on consensus decisions on the EU posture by member states? Without going into details about the different rules of procedure in place in different settings, the solution needs clearly to be seen as one of informal dialogue, as I experienced myself when posted to Vienna for quite a number of years. But informal dialogue in turn requires trust from member states, and then the only way to develop this trust is through dialogue internally in the EU, and importantly, I would argue, through engaging member states' representatives, not as passive onlookers when the EU talks to the outside world, but as the High Representative has indicated, by developing roles for member states, which are useful in this context, building on the comparative strength of different actors in different settings. Here it's still early days after the entry into force of the Lisbon Treaty, but hopefully the EU global strategy can help to set the stage for a new phase in EU external action in this sense. So again, not only one message, but as far as possible a frame of reference here. The difficulty in terms of effectiveness does not stop here. Dialogue also has to take into account an enhanced level of disinformation and propaganda in the international system. Countering that will not only require a much bigger volume of EU communication through different channels, much more attention will have to be given to the soft power approach, which includes carefully calibrating the impact of messages in terms of perceptions. Diplomacy increasingly needs to be developed in local contexts and not only in a speaking but also listening mode on the basis of enhanced knowledge and understanding of cultural, historical and other conditions. Sometimes this means being able to ask questions and carefully listening to the information from interlocutors. Sometimes it will have to mean seeking informal dialogue with civil society, as illustrated by the Arab Spring. I'll come back later to this issue of seeing dialogue also as a negotiation, where there are important contributions from the academic community, illustrated by the Harvard Negotiating School, for instance, or in Europe, Sant'Egidio and its work, focusing on identifying and developing common ground with interlocutors, with the slogan of not saying no, but trying to say yes as often as possible. All with the strategic purpose in mind, based on an effort to broaden the sense of ownership of joint goals and objectives, not only for European but global development. And the more one can look at the stage for dialogue in a global perspective, the better it will be for progress, as illustrated by the Global Summit on Migration taking place as I speak in New York. So in that context, it should possibly be an option to not just have defensive reactions to irregular migration in Europe, but also addressing root causes at the same time as one tries to convince more countries to take a responsibility.